It's a minute past the hour, so let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Basia Coulter. I'm a healthcare and life sciences partner at Globant. We are a technology services company, and within our healthcare and life sciences division, which we call Healthcare and Life Sciences Studio, I lead research and development for life sciences. So our strategy and our services for life sciences organizations, specifically in the area of research and development, and that includes clinical trials. So it's my distinct pleasure to host today experts in the area and to engage in a discussion on a 360 approach to patient identification, recruitment and enrollment to clinical trials. Before I invite our guests to introduce themselves, just a couple of housekeeping items. There is a Q&A section here that is available to all attendees. It will be monitored. Please feel free to post questions. We hope to have a few minutes towards the end of the webinar to answer those questions. The webinar is being recorded, and we will make the recording available to all registered participants afterwards. So with that, I'd like to invite my guests to introduce themselves. And since I've just introduced myself as part of Globant, I'm going to start with Mikkel, my fellow Glober. Mikkel, go ahead, introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Basia. My name is Mikkel. I've been with Globant for 14 years. I specialized in product launch with big pharma companies such as Roche, Lilly, Biogen, Novo Nordisk, GSK, etc. But specifically, I specialize in how we leverage digital strategy and execution in product launches, from clinical trials over market shaping, disease awareness, and into the commercial launch. So across the product life cycle. Nice to be here.
Thank you very much, Mikkel. Amy from Medacity, please, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Basia. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. My name is Amy Apostolaris. I serve as Global Head of Medacity's Digital Clinical Trial Solutions Division. I have over 25 years of experience in life sciences, including public health, healthcare, pharma development, and digital health technologies. Medacity is a leading digital health technology company that has been serving the pharma industry and life sciences for over a decade. And we provide comprehensive digital solutions for clinical trial ecosystems, from patient recruitment and enrollment, active study data, patient analytics, and predictive modeling through AI/ML. The Medacity platform is an enterprise-level capability that can support biopharma companies, CROs, and investigational sites. Thank you, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Amy. So let's move on to our Dexter guests. Why don't we start with John? Go ahead and introduce yourself, please.
Thanks so much, Basia, and hello, everybody. So my name is Dr. Jyotsing Jandan. So I'm an Executive Director of Customer Success here at Dexter. Alongside this, though, I work as a practicing public health physician, and I also work as a Clinical Associate Professor in Public Health at the University of Birmingham. For today's webinar, I'll be contributing with my thoughts around the use of real-world data for clinical trials, and I'll hand over to Dan to speak a little bit more about what we do at Dexter.
Thanks, Joe.
Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Hi, I'm Dan Summers. I'm the CEO of Dexter. My background is startups and university spinouts, and I've been helping the University of Birmingham to spin out what is now called Dexter. And my background is over 25 years in investment and spinouts in digital technologies, including health technologies.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Dan. So we're here today to talk about identifying, recruiting, and enrolling patients in clinical trials. And this is not a new challenge. This is something that has been cited over the years as a key factor contributing to long timelines for which clinical trials are notorious, and by extension, as a significant contributor to the cost of bringing treatments to market. So a lot of smart people have tried to solve that problem over the years, and we know that there are a lot of solutions out there that are tackling the issue. What can we do differently to effectively reach patients, to reach caregivers, to reach physicians, and actually move the needle in patient recruitment and enrollment in clinical trials? I'm going to invite Mikkel to get started. Mikkel, you have worked extensively with pharma organizations, with life sciences organizations in other parts of the product life cycle, pharmaceutical product life cycle, parts other than clinical trials. What can we learn from the work that you've done there for making a difference in clinical trial recruitment?
Thank you for the question, Basha. I think you're right. I think that we are an industry built on a very solid go-to-market model, but also one that is heavily based on traditional face-to-face interactions and outreach, right? Whether it is a field force, payer access, trial recruitment, and face-to-face is still like really important. But there has just been a major shift in how we retrieve information as patients, as HCPs, and ultimately how we make decisions. So I think a shift where we today, when we need an answer, pick up this one, right? To get an answer. And that's digitalization of information and decision journey in all aspects of life. And I think we need to also think about our go-to-market models in that context. Some would say that we don't go online, we simply live online today, and occasionally go offline if we are lucky enough to go offline on our vacation. And COVID has seriously accelerated this, and that's also what we can see from outside of healthcare, and specifically a clinical trials area. Patients during COVID, they didn't go to see doctors, they went online for answers. Doctors couldn't see patients, so they turned to technology. Doctors couldn't see pharma, so they went online. And technology itself has also developed and made accessibility so different. So if we look at sales and marketing, they already on the digital journey have been it for quite some time, quickly adapted to COVID. And actually, I think payers and access organizations also started creating digital strategies for outreach and engagement. And I think it's the same huge opportunity we have. We need to fish where the fish are. So our patients and HCPs that are relevant to our trials online, they're online, and we need to find out where they are and be there with them, reach them and engage them. So finally, if we think of the recruitment journey from unaware to participating in a trial as a funnel, I believe the potential lies at the top of the funnel. The scale that digital offers to reach massive numbers of people and potential participants that we don't necessarily reach through traditional means. And that's why I think the potential is, and where I can see techniques used elsewhere in healthcare, but also outside.
Thank you for that, Mikkel. So we are talking about finding patients, finding caregivers, finding physicians where they are, where they live online. But of course, and you will talk a little later about exactly how we do that. But fundamentally, we are, as you said, fishing. We don't necessarily know upfront exactly who those people are and where they are when we're trying to find and reach them. So that leads me to the next question, and maybe Dan and Jot could start answering that, is what would then be the role of real world data? So in this context, by real world data, we mean any kind of healthcare data or healthcare related data that are generated in the course of real lives as we go through our healthcare journey. What is the role of that type of data in helping us find the right patients for clinical trials?
Absolutely, Basha. It's so there is so much opportunity. Like all big data, there's also a lot of mess, a lot of noise, a lot of biases, a lot of error, and you know, people can sleepwalk into what they think is the right answer, but there's plenty of the big data answers that have been proven ill-founded. What we see is that with Dexter is an agnostic platform, and we have access to records that are over 1 billion patients worldwide, over 30 countries, covering 60% of the world's population. We believe that's a diverse enough data set to compare and contrast. And this comes from hospitals, it comes from physicians' practices, it comes from tertiary care, dentists, there's other ophthalmologists, there's other data sets that it comes from, and it's making sense of this data in a properly scientific, transparent way. If you can do that, and you can do that demonstrably and reproduce it in a reproducible way, then you can turn RWD into what's called RWE, real world evidence, and that then becomes statistically significant, relevant clinical data for people to actually take decisions. And of course, you know, once you have the power of data in that way, then you have the nirvana that I think we've just been talking about.
Thank you, Dan. Anything to add, Jot?
Yeah, I think just building on what Dan and Mikkel both said, I guess one of the beauties and the luxuries that we've got actually within the real world data space is, if we think back to how traditional clinical trials are undertaken, how they're designed, they often have quite strict inclusion and exclusion criteria. And what that can do is it can lead to findings which can be quite limited and quite specific to a very similar or homogeneous patient population. Whereas actually with real world data, we've got that diversity in the data set there, which can open up the opportunities for trial recruitment to a wider group of patients. And actually just in addition to this as well, just as Dan had mentioned, here at Dexter, we've developed tools to actually support with the identification of suitable patients. But we can also go one step further than that. We can also think about patients who regularly interact with healthcare services or are potentially, may have appointments in the pipeline, so can provide opportunities for future recruitment, which we wouldn't otherwise think about in our traditional trial recruitment processes. So these are just some of the additional applications of real world data in this space.
Thank you, Jot. Amy, anything to add from your experience?
Yes, and all great points. I think that certainly being able to access patient information through their real world life is crucial in identifying patients, and specifically to raise awareness for clinical trials. In speaking about one of the most exciting topics right now, which is artificial intelligence and machine learning, I would like to add, ways that AI/ML can be used with real-world data to identify and qualify the right patients. My experience at Medacity has been with artificial intelligence and machine learning, and it has been utilized for over a decade. I know right now it's quite exciting, but it has been used to provide healthcare, clinical development, disease management solutions, and for recruitment and enrollment of patients. Particularly when we talk about recruitment and qualification of patients, utilizing AI, ML, smart technology, as we call it, we can implement these learnings and generative AI across various real-world data sources to identify, qualify, and make sure you're getting the right patients based on the criteria for the clinical trial. Examples would be natural language processing through electronic health records, large language models, and generative AI to be able to communicate with physicians and patients and engage and support patients before they even engage in a clinical trial, engaging sites and all clinical trial stakeholders. Utilizing AI ML will improve the process of the entire enrollment timeline and actually accelerate it. So yes, great points, and real-world data is essential.
Thanks a lot, Amy. So I want to double click a little more on what we're talking about. So we've talked about the role of digital outreach, if you will, in reaching relevant stakeholders, so primarily patients, but also their caregivers and their physicians, where they are online in the digital space. We've talked about trying to find them from a different perspective, but by looking for relevant real-world data that is indicative of their qualification for a specific clinical trial that we may be interested in recruiting in. So I want to take a couple of perspectives and invite you to continue this discussion in the light of those perspectives. So the first one is from the perspective of the patient. Enabling patients access to clinical trials as potentially one alternative to healthcare, to available standards of care, but also to enable a greater diversity of patients in clinical trials and to enable a better representation of patients that better reflects the actual diversity of human population in the real world, right? So that's one perspective to look at the problem. And the other perspective is from the perspective of those entities that are trying to find that diverse population of patients. So from the perspective of sponsors, or sites or CROs that are looking for qualifying patients, and they're looking for those patients in numbers that will ensure a sufficient statistical power for the study to be significant and to show outcomes. So let's start with real-world data. How do we see the role of real-world data in helping us address the challenge of the diversity of the population in clinical trials? Dan, I'm going to start with you for that one.
And it's a really topical point. It is one of the main challenges in clinical trials is that studies are still done on white Caucasian people and biased towards males in many cases, just because of how the research propagates. And this, again, it comes back to the kind of biases that we talked about earlier. By having an access to over 1 billion patients, you have diversity in as many, 30 countries, 60% of the population, as we mentioned. You now have the opportunity to reach people in all kinds of diverse environments. And also, if you're recruiting for things like rare diseases, or with conditions where there's if you like, a grey area about what those conditions are, because either the research is new or because the conditions are complex. Patients might not even know that they are able to be targeted, or they have the opportunity, and sometimes they may not even know that they have a risk of the condition concern, and therefore would be suitable for a control group or for a non-control group. So, by having a very wide net and by having a very good engine to make sure that that is dealt with statistically correctly, there are clearly the opportunities that you outlined on both sides of the fence. There obviously the main consideration being the ethical one, that allows people to not be contacted, and obviously those ethics have to be and are in the Dexter platform as part of naturally only there by an opt-in from the data provider and the patient themselves.
Thank you. And one follow-up question for you, Dan. When you say that we have access to almost 1 billion patients, can you elaborate a little bit on that? What does that actually mean? So
what it means is we have an agnostic platform that has a data model that has some very, very flexible inputs. And of all the data that we have tested and that we know about that we could use, there is a diversity of data sets, all made for different reasons by different national or private providers in lots and lots of countries. And it's the flexibility of the platform to be able to ingest and to statistically properly transform that data into a usable and comparative output. And we've done studies as well, just to cross-compare diverse populations for the same condition with all the factors taken care of, and we get the same answer out. So we, if you like, can normalize and have normalized between data sets. So that is what we're talking about here.
Thank you. Before we move on to Amy, I was curious if, Jot, you could talk a little bit about what actually happens when we are saying that we're identifying patients for clinical trials or matching patients for clinical trials. We're using these words. We're talking about using real-world data to identify patients. We're talking about patient matching. What does that actually mean? What is the process that leads us to that identification?
Yeah, great question, Basia, and thank you for that. So at Dexter, there's a few ways that we do rapidly facilitate this process. There's lots of different methods and approaches that we can take, but there's a few which actually we really have honed in and developed some expertise on. So firstly, a lot of real world data is structured. And what I mean by that are certain diagnoses are recorded using hierarchical coding systems. So for example, ICD systems that people may be aware of globally. At Dexter, we can identify patients with a combination of coded diagnosis, test results, and also lifestyle factors. So across that breadth of plethora of data sets, which Dan was talking about, to identify patients who could meet the eligibility criteria for your particular study. So that's the easiest way of thinking about this. But we're all aware that, structured data can only take us so far, and that there's a lot of information within the medical record, which we need to also delve into further. So building on this, particularly during the COVID pandemic and using some work that we did around long COVID, we're actually able to improve some of these processes by handling unstructured data. So I know Amy mentioned it briefly beforehand, but we can also use approaches such as natural language processing to convert some of that unstructured data into structured data. So we can harness the depth of knowledge that's actually withheld within the free text and in the medical record. So again, it's another way that we can boost finding those eligible patients. But in addition to these approaches, because again, what we are still relying on is the fact that individuals have been diagnosed with a particular condition, there are other approaches and technical capabilities that we've built into the tools here at Dexter to support you also inputting systems such as, for example, if you have a prediction model that you think could identify patients for cardiovascular disease in the future, we can input that prediction model and run it within the data sets to identify patients who may be at risk of a specific diagnosis. But again, also, we're quite conscious that is one way of doing it, but we really want to be at the forefront of this. So there's a couple of other advanced techniques that we've started to develop and use at Dexter, and we've had some really good success with some of these. So we're currently applying machine learning models and approaches to identify patients where existing prediction models don't exist. So this is particularly important for rare diseases, and actually that's quite an important area when thinking about how we can use real world evidence to identify patients who might be suitable for trial recruitment. So these sort of approaches work well when we're working with a data provider, where we can identify the patients at the end of this process. And there's a couple of examples which maybe we can talk about later where we've done that. But we are also conscious and cognizant that in certain countries, in certain circumstances, it may not be possible to identify patients. So also at Dexter, we have got approaches that can support you to identify and potential patients or groups of patients who you may wish to recruit for your particular trials. So an example of some work that we're starting to build and do is that we can make use of prescription data to identify clinicians who are prescribing certain medications, which may be bespoke to certain patient groups. So rather than thinking about targeting the patient directly in situations where that is not a viable option, we can also facilitate you in terms of reaching out to their clinicians who may be supporting those patients. And lastly, just because you'd mentioned it as well, one of the notorious challenges that we have in traditional clinical trials, and it's particularly relevant for rare diseases, is that we often find it really hard or quite challenging to identify suitable control patients. And one of the luxuries that we have within real world evidence is that we've got a huge database of potential controls who may be relevant to that particular trial. So we can identify suitable controls from our broader population, and we can match them. And when I say match them, we can try and find patients with like for like characteristics to those who you may have recruited in your trial already. So there's a huge range of ways that actually we can use this kind of data to facilitate clinical trials. But yeah, I'll hand back over to you, Basia. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And so this was very interesting because one of the things you mentioned, Jot, was that you've done some of the work while working with healthcare providers, for example. So that would be a situation, for example, where there is a site or a hospital that is running a clinical trial, and then they leveraging technology in the way that you've described to identify patients within their electronic health records or electronic medical records or across their particular healthcare systems. But Amy, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how we can help sponsors to leverage real world data in identifying and finding qualifying patients for clinical trials.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you, Jot, for really expanding what the view is with real world data and the capabilities that are out there. And I think that in addition to the challenge of identifying and matching, really finding those quality patients, is essentially the process of taking that data and putting them through a what's currently a manual process, being able to access the patients, access their physicians, and enable the process of final qualification of the patient, and then enrollment of that patient in one digital platform. What Medacity has done is, in addition to being able to pull in real world data, identify, match patients, even genomic data, lab data, is to be able to utilize our software to take that process and make it more efficient and much more simple, so that as a sponsor, you can track every single de-identified patient, you can track the physician, you can track the site and see how far along each de-identified patient is in the process, and then essentially from every step of the way, view that patient into the enrollment queue. What that does is certainly speeds up, accelerates the process, prevents loss of patients who are quite valuable, especially in rare disease trials, because oftentimes you have multiple stakeholders, you have the issue of coordinating across sites, coordinating different stakeholders, multiple silos, and patients do get lost. There are, especially in competitive trials. We know non-small cell lung cancer as an example is hugely competitive. How do we make sure that once we find that patient, that we don't let that patient go to another trial or get lost and perhaps have a second thought? But by allowing those patients that we do find through the real world data analytics and having them aggregated into a portal for each specific stakeholder, the site, the sponsor, even the physician, allows for that process to move forward and enables, again, that process to move more swiftly to the enrollment of the patient, randomization at the site. So I think that's very important as well, to make sure we have top of mind. And I think the two together, or the multiple approaches that we have together, will make that timeline accelerated.
Thank you, Amy. So we're talking about using real-world data to address the challenges to recruitment in clinical trials from two perspectives, right? One, from the perspective of enabling patients access to clinical trials and improving the representation of patient population in clinical trials to make them more diverse and representative of real-world human population. And from the other end of things, we're talking about empowering sponsors and enabling sponsors and sites to actually reach those patients who potentially could qualify for the clinical trials that they are recruiting for. So on a circle back, we've just talked about the role of real-world data in that process. I want to circle back to digital techniques, digital outreach approaches. And I want to invite you, Mikkel, to tell us more about how that works. You mentioned earlier that we can learn a lot on the clinical trial side from colleagues who have leveraged digital outreach approaches in medical affairs and in commercial or healthcare even. Tell us more about how that approach plays out in clinical trial recruitment.
Right, I'll try to do that. We often get the question like, how do we find them, right? How do we find them? How do we reach them? How do we engage them? How do we drive them towards our trial and make them aware of our trials? How do we catch all the patients who do not get into the clinic today for all the reasons that we all know, whether it is one or the other of reasons? You know, how do we get a hold of those large numbers here? And I think if we want to reach any kind of person digitally, whether it's for a trial or prescribe a new drug or even sell a car, I think we need to take an outside-in approach, where we need to first and foremost start understanding what is the role of digital in people's lives today, and try to use those insights to then create an outreach strategy here. And if you use a model, for example, like the digital IQ model, to analyze the digital landscape and identify, you know, what are the patients and ATPs that are relevant for our trial, but also finding out what is the competing information that kind of prevents them from participating in the trial. There might be a competing trial, there might be somebody who is arguing against trial, there might be a lot of competitive information out there. You want to know that too. And then finally, what about the community out there? How can we work with the community? And the digital IQ analysis analyzes those three things: the target audiences, the competitive landscape, and the community across search engines, across social, across third-party platforms, websites, apps, to try to understand a given population for a given trial. What is the unmet information need that drives them online? What do they talk about? What do they feel? What do they search for? Thoughts, feelings, worries, and really try to understand that level, which gives us information that we can tap into and be relevant in our outreach, and then drive them towards the awareness of a trial, the positives and the upsides of participating in a trial, and really drive them through that funnel that I talked about before. And I think that's the value here. But you got to understand, where are they and how can we reach them? What are the channels they are in that we can reach them? And what are the content and the messages that resonates with them, that drives them online to look for answers that we want to be able to provide them and get in a dialogue with them. think that is important, and that is what something like the digital IQ research can help you with. And then on the back of that, the strategy, of course, in terms of how do we reach out, through which channels, with what kind of content, and in which order do we introduce our trial to the patient. And of course, the same scenario exactly with the HCPs.
Thank you, Mikkel. So one thing that comes to mind here, and in a moment we're going to talk about data privacy implications for the different types of approaches that we're talking about here. But one thing that comes to mind is an opportunity to use real world data to find populations of patients of interest. So patients who match the criteria that we are looking for a particular clinical trial. If we're finding those populations of patients in de-identified data, so data in which we do not know the identity of the individual patients, but we can have access to aggregate statistics about them, including the fact where they can be found geographically, for example, down to the healthcare system, where they see physicians and so on and so forth, then you can imagine deploying digital outreach capabilities to launch campaigns in a much more geographically targeted way than otherwise, which the digital marketing capabilities today allow us to do. So we can launch campaigns very selectively to different geographies at the granularity, I believe, of even a city or town. Mikkel, you're an expert here. But I think we can be pretty precise, right, in where we deploy our campaigns if we have the intel that's where there is a possibility of finding the right patients.
Absolutely. First and foremost, I would say when you gather the insights and the data in the digital IQ, it's aggregate data, so we don't have identifiable information, and it's from that we work. But you're completely right. You see, for example, big pockets of patients having very relevant conversations around unmet needs and being, uncontrolled on a certain medication in a specific area or a specific community. And by identifying the geographical area, but also, where do these conversations take place? What are their interests? What are the thought leaders or the third-party platforms that is being used around? That you are able to do a very targeted approach and reaching out to those audiences in a context that they're already in and drive toward trial. Of course, you need to be sensitive towards how you do it. But that has proven extremely effective in terms of finding and targeting specific audiences. And the targeting engine today in digital is just phenomenal. So you're able to also track afterwards exactly how you're performing across those different campaigns.
Thank you, Mikkel. So I wanted to move on a little bit and talk about the data privacy aspect of using the methods that we're talking about here, because obviously when we're talking about real world data, when we're talking about healthcare data, we're talking about sensitive data, and we're talking about patients' rights to not be contacted. It is a challenging problem to weigh, because on the one hand, we're talking about enabling access for patients who may be looking for solutions, who may be looking for access to clinical trials. On the other hand, we have to acknowledge that every individual has the right to privacy, and that we need to operate within the bounds of respect for that privacy and, of course, associated regulations. So I'm curious, Amy, maybe we can start with you. You mentioned earlier at a high level how Medacity platform works. Help us understand a little more how that works vis-a-vis data privacy.
Sure, yes. And, great point about data privacy, extremely important, especially in this day and age with ensuring secure patient information. So about almost 3 years ago, Medacity launched the Reach digital platform. It's a solution that has the capability, as we just spoke earlier, of recruiting patients, determining their eligibility through AI/ML, and essentially accessing the physicians, not the patients directly, but accessing their physicians and then pulling the information and the patients once they opt in to multiple connected hubs. So I'll just try to describe that a little bit. So when we utilize the Reach digital platform, it essentially creates a mechanism that automates and accelerates that process of identifying, qualifying the patients for the trial, and then enabling all stakeholders to track and manage that process in real time. Once we are able to qualify patients, identifying them through the artificial intelligence, through the algorithm, using that software, and various real-world data sources. We are looking at claims data, pharmacy data, lab data, genomic data, even social determinants of health, as well as electronic health records, as Jot mentioned, to qualify those patients that meet the criteria of the study. The way that we are able to maintain data privacy is that once those patients are pre-qualified through the platform, they are linked to their HCP, who could be an investigator site or a private physician. And the physician then is able to connect with that patient, confirm eligibility, confirm that they are, of course, not only screened, but fully eligible based on the criteria to be in the clinical trial, and then refers them again through the mechanism electronically to the enrollment status and then randomization at the site. As I mentioned before, by mechanizing this process, we accelerate the that step between, and not only the step of a patient having entered in a clinical trial, but actually raising awareness. And there are statistics out there that show that I think it's over 60% of patients were willing to enroll in a clinical trial if referred by their physician, because of the trust that they have in their physician. So that what's most important here is, to answer your question, Basia, is that the patient is identified, they're linked to their physician, the physician is then able to communicate with their patient, confirm enrollment, and then move them mechanically, electronically, and digitally into the enrollment queue, which then begins that process of randomization. And we are maintaining data privacy throughout because, of course, the physician-patient privacy is in existence.
Thank you thank you very much for that, Amy. And I'm going to summarize this a little bit in a moment, but I do want to give Jot an opportunity to speak a little more about how you guys at Dexter handle data privacy, what that means for you, who can get access to what, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, thanks, Basia, and thank you, Amy, for that brilliant answer, actually. So what I'll do is what Amy's outlined there is essentially thinking about the data privacy on the patient-facing end of sort of the 360 process that we're describing here, whereas what we do at Dexter is we probably take that step further back and think about data privacy, about how we manage a collective group of patients in terms of their data privacy and sort of their data governance issues. So one of the unique aspects around Dexter is that the software we've developed can be deployed in your own environment. So for example, clients who host their own data, however messy you deem it to be, we have no expectation for you to share data with us or with our partners here on the call. What we can do is we can overlay our software on your existing electronic health record, and then the process to ensuring good data governance would actually just be in line with your usual data processes, which are often quite straightforward to navigate. So that's the easiest way of managing this or thinking about it. But here at Dexter, we actually can go one step further, and we can also support you develop your own secure data environment. So within your own clinical setting or non-clinical setting, where you can specify a select few individuals within your organizations who can see or manipulate the raw data. We can essentially create a wall around that data, a digital wall around that data, where Dexter is the gatekeeper to that data. So the other organization members within your organization could actually just see the aggregated outputs of, for example, the searches or the various outputs that you're interested in. But that's for clients who have their own data. And for clients who don't have their own data, I think just building on something which Dan mentioned earlier, we have really strong relationships with international data providers who do provide us anonymized data. And actually using the anonymized data, we can go back to the data providers with a unique list of patient identifiers. And then working with the data provider together, we can work collectively to consent patients within trials. And a recent example that we're currently doing at the moment is we're recruiting patients who have gestational diabetes in a trial where we're working with one of our data partners, Segedim. And that's a process where we're facilitating that. But in terms of the actual software we've developed, so at every level, so at an application level, we've implemented role-based access. So we've ensured that only those individuals who need to see the data, who within your organization you felt have met the certain thresholds regarding training or appropriate use, only they can access that and use the data. And lastly, I think because we've had a lot of conversation around AI approaches and also machine learning, we're very committed as an organization to making sure that everything we do is auditable and transparent. We don't believe in this black box approach to AI, and actually the outputs that you'll see that we produce provide a step-by-step outline of how those patients were included or excluded from the trial that you're interested in.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Amy. We do have some questions coming in, so we're going to address those questions in a moment. But before we do that, I do want to close the loop on the conversation about data privacy, and so on, and circle back to Mikhail to tell us a little more about how digital IQ works. Because you mentioned earlier, Mikhail, that in the context of digital IQ, we work with aggregate data. We don't have any identifiable information about any single person. So what does it actually mean that we do digital observational research and that we find potential audiences for the message that we are delivering to them?
All right, I think probably the best thing is to use a concrete example. So patients, let's say patients suffering from restless legs syndrome, like myself, suffer from a certain disease. I meet with fellow patients. We discuss the frustrations and the complications and what kind of drugs people are taking and what the doctor says and the frustrations with the doctor and all these kind of things. And we do that across different touch points and different social media. We also go to Google and search for solutions. And these are the digital footprints that we leave us, right? And we share who the thought leaders are and the latest publications. Those are the footprints that is being picked up in the digital IQ at an aggregate level. And that is then fed back to us in Globant when we do this research to understand what is it that worries Mikkel. What's the problem? He's not happy with an existing treatment, for example. We know that he's using search engine, but he's also going to this discussion forum, and he's part of that patient organization. And then we craft a campaign around that speaks to those specific unmet needs and frustrations around my lack of sleep and related to do my job, probably because I'm tired. And those are the things that you tie into your communication and then, reach people that way by connecting with those real life issues and then drive. Again, we're not qualifying for a trial with our digital outreach. The job is to make awareness and then drive people into the right people in the healthcare system who will then take them and qualify them and bring them, into the trial and do that part. So I think that was probably the best example I could come up with.
Thank you, Mikhail. So we are almost 10 minutes before the end of our time together. So I'm going to transition to questions that we have from the audience. One last thing that I want to do before that is to help the audience make connections between the different aspects of potential approaches that we have discussed here. So think about an ability to use a digital IQ and digital outreach capabilities to raise awareness about clinical trials that are currently recruiting, both among patients, among their caregivers, and among their physicians. And then through the deployment of digital campaigns to, speaking of that funnel that Mikkel was describing in the beginning, to bring these patients or physicians or their caregivers to digital solutions such as Medocity platform, where they can opt in to begin a qualification process, for example, if we're speaking about patients, or where they can sign up to start managing the enrollment queue if we're speaking about physicians. Then think about a situation of a physician who knows through maybe a de-identified data set search, he has been made aware that he or she has under their care a population of patients who match criteria. Then you could leverage technology such as Dexter to actually find those patients within the electronic health records and to make the information about them available to the right people, depending on the roles that they're playing in the whole ecosystem. Then for sites, that becomes an incredibly invaluable tool for them to be able with confidence to respond to sponsors' needs for patient recruitment for a particular indication and a particular clinical trial. So let's take a look at some of the questions that we have here. I'm gonna take them in the order in which they came in. We have a couple of questions that are related to what I would call optimization of study protocol design. So there is one question that asks, how can real-world data be used to optimize study protocol design? And a question related to this, I believe, is there a way to suggest eligibility criteria depending on data? So for example, if I could be using stringent criteria, can the system tell if I get rid of, X criteria, I could onboard a particular number or percentage more patients into the trial? In other words, can the real-world data suggest a protocol for a clinical trial to improve the chances of success? This is a great question. I'm going to turn it over to Jot to maybe give us a perspective on that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Basia. I think that's a fantastic question. So thanks to whoever asked it, actually, because it's something which we do encounter quite a bit, because obviously today we've spoken about how real world evidence could be used to support the recruitment, but actually there's a lot of other really important uses of real world evidence when it comes to the whole of the clinical trial process. So what I would pose here is that actually here at Dexter, we've developed a lot of tools that can also support with clinical trial emulation. And what I mean by that is we can help you understand the disease's natural history. So using historic records taken from the huge databases that we do have access to. And what I mean by that is that we can have a deeper understanding from historic patients about the progression, the common comorbidities, the patient demographics of individuals who may have the condition that you're interested in. And the reason why that can be quite important is because it can not only give you an indication of potentially what are suitable inclusion criteria, i.e. based on the sociodemographics of that particular group, but it can also help you with defining relevant endpoints for your particular study. So the reason why that's really helpful to have is if we do have an indication of roughly what proportion of individuals in that cohort are going to go on to develop the outcome of interest, it can really help you with the sample size calculations, which often are some of the most trickiest things when designing clinical trial. So we can give you indications about the potential or expected incident rate or incident rate ratio of certain outcomes, which you may be expecting from your specific question. And in addition to that, actually, just following on from what Basia mentioned there, the tools that we produce and provide in terms of thinking about the inclusion and exclusion criteria, one of the luxuries that we have with real world evidence is this is data which is routinely collected. So it's not collected for the purpose of trials as per se. The data will just continue to be collected as people engage with healthcare services. So the benefits that we can have are that it really relates to the fact that we don't have to have such a strict inclusion criteria, because we can actually follow up a larger proportion of individuals over a longer period of time for relatively a similar cost compared to what we would have had even for a stricter trial approach beforehand. So and actually we can provide certain subgroup analyses to demonstrate, if you carried on with the trial that you're undertaking at the moment, what the impact of that may be compared to if you widen the net of selection that you may be interested in.
Thank you. I'd love to ask a follow-up question, but I may have to stop myself because we have a couple of other great questions from the audience. So there is a question for Amy. Have you had a situation where following individual patients provided information which helped improve process in certain sites where you could be seeing some lower recruitment rates? So I think what the question is asking if the approach you're describing with the digital platform, it can actually help sites that might otherwise see lower recruitment rates, improve those recruitment rates when you're following the process with patient-provided information.
Yeah, great question as well. I think one of the main advantages of REACH in the pre-qualification step and in that mechanism to automate the process is that it lowers the site burden. Patients are already pre-screened and qualified, and then they are eligible to go to a site. So what it does is, of course, improves the site's ability to bring patients in, and of course proceed with the enrollment and of course the randomization. In terms of how it would, I'm not sure what the last part of the question was, how it may cause less patients to be, was that the question? Less patients to be?
No, I think the question is if you've seen the improvement in the recruitment process in sites that otherwise might be seeing lower recruitment rates if they were not, for example, using the type of solutions that we're talking about here.
Yeah, my apologies, I misunderstood the question, but for sure, certainly especially if you have rare disease studies or even highly competitive clinical trials, as I mentioned earlier with NSCLC, when we can go to all parts of the world, I mean, globally, utilizing the different approaches with digital outreach, but also even utilizing real world data, you're not only getting the patients that sites would normally recruit and enroll, you're getting every patient, and the reach is broader. You're able to reach out to physicians and patients who were not even aware of studies, and even those who may have genomic biomarkers that are required for the study that they never even knew they had. So by being able to utilize multiple approaches digitally and through that process, it has definitely improved. We have a number of cases, as an example, where we had 95% improvement in the enrollment of patients just because of the approach that's used, not to utilize sites alone, which I know is a traditional model, but to utilize the digital approach and real world data access. So hopefully that answers.
Thank you, Amy.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I think that did. We have time for one more question. The question is, how do you overcome the compliance challenges with IRB and other review and ethics boards when using AI and ML with patients and sites? And I think this is even a broader question about, you know, how can we take advantage of these type of technologies vis-a-vis various regulatory agencies and compliance requirements that are imposed for obvious reasons in the context of clinical research. Maybe Jod or Dan, would you like to take that one?
I'm happy. Yeah, I'm happy to take that. But I understand it wants to jump in at any point. I think really there's 4 key things that we have to address here. One is in fairness, and one of the benefits that we have at Dexter is we've been doing this for over a decade now. So part of this is also just understanding the regulations and guidelines that are actually outlined by the various IRBs and different data governance protocols. And that's something which we're quite familiar with. So we've been working with data providers and for data partners for a very long time in this particular area. And some of the hints and tips that I would give in this space really revolve around 2 specific areas. One is making sure that you engage with the IRB early in the process. So when you do have a question in mind, when you do have a potential trial coming up, it's critical to engage with the IRB as soon as possible to just demonstrate your approach, to talk through some of those issues, and just a clear ethical justification for the approach you're taking. So AI and ML, so when I mentioned it earlier in the conversation, sometimes these can be referred to as black box approaches, but no longer actually are they necessarily black box approaches. It's really critical that we do ensure that we've got transparent reporting about the AI approaches that we're using. And in particular, one of the challenges that we do have in real world data, real world evidence, is that sometimes the data that is inputted into these AI algorithms may inadvertently sometimes widen inequalities because it may only be collected on certain groups of patients. So another thing that we do at Dexter and also with our data providers is ensuring that we can improve data capture for groups who are underserved or under-resourced in these different data sets. So that's another important area. And just the last key hint and tip, because I'm conscious we're close to time, is it's critical to engage patients early on this process and actually work with your patients to develop protocols that are co-produced, because IRBs do, they do really value the view of patients in this particular setting, and that's something that we've been quite committed to doing in a lot of our work so far.
Yeah, I would have
Thank
to
you.
agree with those. Definitely.
Anything else to add, Amy?
No, I just wanted to say I think those are great points, and as you said, engaging with IRB early on, but also ensuring that your whether it's the tool that's being used or the approach has been vetted through the IRB, and for the most part, any data privacy and security regulations are met. Whether it is GDPR, high trust, etc. So just wanted to add that as well.
Yeah, we're past time, so we do have to end. I think one last comment I would make to this is the whole point of black box AI and ML that Jod alluded to earlier. This is an important aspect to think about when you're using AI and ML in the context of clinical research. Make sure that you're using methods where the AI approach is transparent, that it's clear how the algorithm works, what it does with the data, and regulatory agencies are increasingly getting on board with using these tools as long as they're not black box AI tools. Well, thank you very much for this exciting discussion today. I want to thank our guests for joining us and thank all the participants for taking the time to spend this hour with us. As mentioned earlier, we will be sending the recording to you. We also invite you to take a look at our blog page, where you will find a lot of relevant information related to this conversation, including an article about the 360 approach to patient identification, recruitment, and enrollment. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.